Hey everybody, welcome back to another flipped lesson. And in this lesson, we're going to start off by talking about the muscular system, how it's organized and how it works at the cellular level and the breakdown of muscles. So definitely pay attention, follow along with your notes as we go through. And it's going to be key to understanding as we get more into the bigger picture of muscles and how they all work together. All right, so just think about your muscles, right? I know I had to include a picture of myself up here. What could I say? But our muscles, all right, are really key for lots of things, right? In terms of how our body works. And we always think about movement and power, right? So how do they work? How do they come together on the cellular level to do all the great things that they do? All right, so just a quick reminder, right? If we think back to our tissues, we're always working our way up, right? Cells, tissues, organ system. There's three types of muscle tissue, okay? We have skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, as you remember. So skeletal, right, it's striated or striped, right, for extra strength, and we'll talk about that today. And it's voluntary, we can control it. Smooth muscle, a little bit weaker, right? Involuntary, we don't control it. It controls things like our blood vessels, our digestive system. And we have our cardiac muscle, our heart, right, which helps our heart pump constantly all the time, moving blood around. Again, involuntary. So just remember these three, and we'll really I think we'll kind of like go on the basis of we're talking about skeletal muscle as we go through this, especially as we're talking about the striations. So, but just remember our three types of muscle tissue that we've talked about and where we would find these types of muscles, all right, or muscle cells. So first off, right, so I'm just going to say right out the bat here that there's going to be a bunch of words, okay, and we just need to remember we're going to go from big to small, okay? So just making sure that, and using these pictures, right? I mean, I would even take a screenshot of some of these pictures or find your own online that kind of helps show the breakdown of muscles, because understanding what is at each level is really important to how they work, okay? So here's a muscle, right? And muscles are composed of many fibers, okay? And we could see it's kind of, I think about, as we go into this, think about muscles like a rope. All right, I have a piece of climbing rope here, which I'm going to try my best on the camera to see, but I'm sure you've all seen some rope, right? Rope is really strong. Okay, we can hang things from it. We can go mountain climbing. And what is rope, right? It's made up of smaller fibers wound together, which are smaller fibers. And again, let me hold it up here, and you can see the end's kind of burnt. But inside this rope, we have smaller. It's a little burnt there, but smaller fibers, which are made up of smaller fibers and little ropes kind of wound together, right? When you put these all together, though, okay, we get some really strong rope that even I can hang from to do some mountain climbing, okay? So muscles are kind of just, they have that same structure, right? We have big muscles, which are really strong, but if we break it down, you see it's like a big rope made up by little ropes that come together, which are made up by little ropes. And even when we get inside the little ropes, you'll see there's even more little ropes, all right? So think about muscles as many packs together that give them strength. And so they're made up of fibers, right? And these individual fibers would be like the muscle cells. Okay, and they are organized into these bundles called fascicles, right? So you can see this is a fascicle with all these fibers. Fascicle, fibers, fascicle, fibers. All right. Now let's get a little deeper and more detailed on how we talk about these. Before we do that, though, right? Individual muscles are separated by a connective tissue called fascia, right, which also forms tendons, right? And we know tendons are connective tissue. Tendons connect muscle to bone. And think about as we dissect our cats, right? We said that cobwebby substance that's kind of covering between the skin and the muscles, right? That's fascia. And we could see down here, right, we're pulling up a piece of fascia. Here's some muscles here. We're into the red, the muscles. There's some fascia. All right. So that fascia covers our individual muscles. Okay. It's a white connective tissue. So again, getting deeper into these. Okay. So we have a muscle here, right? And going from outer to innermost layer. So the epimysium is the outermost layer. It surrounds the entire muscle. So if this is like your bicep here, right, this outer pink layer is the connective tissue that surrounds the muscle. Okay, so epimysium. Then we have the perimysium. Okay, and that separates and surrounds the individual fascicles, okay, or bundles of muscle fibers, which we just talked about. So again, here's all these fascicles, right? The connective tissue that surrounds them is the perimysium. So epimysium, perimysium. And then we have the endomysium, right? Think about endo, inside or in the middle. Okay, those surround each individual muscle fiber. So epimysium, paramysium, endomysium around these muscle fibers or muscle cells. And again, it's just remembering. So this is the connective tissue that surrounds those parts of the muscle. We have the whole muscle, we have the muscle fascicles, and then we have the muscle fibers, right? All these fibers in one fascicle, just like our rope. Okay, so those are the connective tissue layers that separate each of those. Cool. So let's talk about inside the actual muscle cell or muscle fiber. And what we're gonna, we're kind of briefly going over this in this video, and we're gonna talk this week more in depth on like how these muscles actually contract at the cellular level. But to do that, it's really important that we know these words. Okay, so I'll just give you the definitions to write down first as I read through them. If I'm done, you don't have them written down, pause the video, and then I'll move on to the picture next so you can actually see what we're talking about. So we have the sarcolemma, right, which is the muscle fiber membrane. So that's the membrane around that muscle cell, that muscle fiber. The next is the sarcoplasm. Key word there, or half a word, plasm, right? The sarcoplasm is the inner material that surrounds the fibers in the muscle cell. So sarcoplasm is just like cytoplasm. If you remember back to your awesome biology teachers, you'll remember the cytoplasm, right, is the fluid that fills the cell. Okay, so that sarcoplasm is similar, that material that surrounds fibers. Then you have the myofibrils. Okay, these are the individual parallel muscle fibers within that sarcoplasm. So we have these three parts inside the muscle cells: the sarcolemma, right, the membrane; the sarcoplasm, the material, kind of like the cytoplasm; and the myofibrils, which are those muscle fibers. So pause it if you didn't write those down yet, and then move along. All right, so we're going to get a little more in depth and show us where those pictures are, okay? So we're actually going to start at the bottom here. So we'll go more in depth, okay? Looking at a bicep down below, which is a muscle. You zoom in on that. You see all the fascicles here inside the muscle, which have all the fiber. So the fascicle, right, surrounded by that connective tissue, the paramysium. And then inside those, the fascicle are the muscle fibers. So each one of these circles now, as you can see, it comes out here, is a muscle cell, right? Surrounded by the endomysium, okay? So cell, fiber, right? They're synonymous. So those muscle cells come out. Now what we're talking about is inside, right? These three words we just had, as we said at the top of the slide, are inside the muscle fiber, inside the muscle cell. So this now, or this picture up here, is zooming in here, which is one muscle cell. Muscle cell inside a fascicle, inside a muscle, okay? So look at it, right? I mean, it's a cell, so it's got some nucleus. So we see the nucleus in here. Hopefully you guys remember what these organelles are: the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria. Obviously, why do muscle cells have a lot of mitochondria? Because they use a lot of ATP. They're really strong. All right. But looking at the words we just talked about, we have the sarcolemma, right, which is that membrane that covers it, and mitochondria we just talked about. The sarcoplasm fills the space, just like the cytoplasm. And then we have the myofibril. So again, a myofibril now are these fibers inside a muscle cell, or fiber inside a fascicle inside a muscle. Oh my God, it's awesome. All right. But this myofibril is key. It's really what allows our muscles to contract, all right, and do what they have to do. Okay, so screenshot this if you need to, or if you haven't, I would say, put it in your notes. It's a really good breakdown here of what it is. Okay, so let's move along here. So what are myofibrils made out of? Now going even deeper, right? So they have two types of filaments, okay? Actin and myosin, all right? And the actin are the thin filaments, and the myosin are the thick filaments. At the end, we'll see a little GIF here, a little video of how they actually work. And again, like I said, in our next lesson, we'll talk about how these work. So it's really important that you know right now what these filaments are. So actin, thin, is what I always think about it. Actin, add a H, thin, actin, thin, right? Myosin, thick, okay? Those are what the myofibrils, which are the fibers that make up the muscle cell or fiber, which all those muscle cells make up a fascicle, and all those fascicles make up a muscle. Woohoo, we're getting good here. All right, moving along. So the myofilaments, right, which are the actin and the myosin, okay? This is where, remember we talked about the striated? We see the different colors or the stripes. They actually are formed by the actin and myosin, okay? We have what's called the A band or dark. That's a good way to remember it. A, dark, I, light. A, dark, I, light. And again, I would write these in your notes, ways to remember them. So the dark bands are the thick, the myosin, okay? The light bands are the thin. So think I, light, thin, actin, okay? So we can see here, right? The dark bands are those thick myosin. The light bands are the thin actin bands. Okay. And this, again, one segment of a muscle cell. And here's those myofibrils we're talking about. You can see dark, light, dark, light. And that's what actually makes up the cell, the actin and myosin. Cool. All right. So moving along here, this is where we're going to touch on, but we'll talk more about next in our next lesson when we're in class. Okay. So again, same picture here. We're looking at one myofibril. All right. We now see that we have all these really cool terms here. All right. Which it might seem overwhelming at first, but it's not too bad. So looking at one myofibril, we have this word here we're going to write down in a second, which is a sarcomere. All right. But again, just to orient ourselves, we see the dark bands here, right? Which dark A band, so dark A, that's the myosin, and the light or thin or actin are right here, the I band. So dark, light, dark, light, dark, light. And again, it goes all the way down our muscle cell. How do muscles actually contract? Well, it all happens right here. We see these Z discs, they're called, which is in the actin band, the I band right there. We have the H zone, like the letter H. And those all make up this thing called a sarcomere. And that's the key to understanding how muscles contract, okay? This one right here. The sarcomere is the basic contractile unit of a muscle cell, okay? So how do muscle cells contract? Well, it all happens at the sarcomere. And again, one sarcomere goes from Z line to Z line. So definitely write that down. One sarcomere goes from Z line to Z line. And again, those Z lines, as you get in this little drawing here or representation, those Z lines take place in the I band, I, light, actin, right? M band, or excuse me, A band, myosin, thick. All right. So one sarcomere goes from Z line to Z line, right? So myosin in the middle, actin on each side. And that's where contraction happens. And if we look, I'm just going to, hopefully you wrote this down already, basic contractile unit of a muscle cell. And we also write that sarcomeres go from Z line to Z line. And again, if we look, we've talked about a bunch of times already just in this video, right? These muscles are striated, okay? They have these nice dark light, dark light, dark light. Well, what gives the dark light? It's each of these sarcomeres, right? Or a myofibril, okay? Well, this is the myofibril, but this is the sarcomere, right? You can see it's just sarcomere, 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 sarcomere. So all the way down that muscle fiber, okay? So how do muscle cells contract? Well, we're saying the sarcomeres are this contractile unit. So if I have one sarcomere that contracts, but I have 1,000 sarcomeres on one muscle fiber, well, guess what? If they all contract at the same time, what's going to happen to that muscle fiber? Whoosh, right? So adding all these little pieces together get us a big muscle contraction. And that's why I can go take my bicep and go from really big, contract it to really small, right? All those sarcomeres come together. All right, so those sarcomeres, the Z line to Z line here, again, actin, myosin, are the contractile unit, okay? And again, just another picture here breaking it down. Muscle, fascicles, muscle fiber, muscle cell. One word we didn't talk about, I think we'll talk about it more in the next lesson, is a sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sounds like endoplasmic reticulum. You catching along here? Since this is a cell, we kind of use a lot of the same root words. And those have to help with muscle contraction. But then inside there, we have the myofibrils, right? We have the actin, the myosin, and you can see that here, right? M line, I line. This is a sarcomere. Nice Z line to Z line. Okay, and you can see It's like a Z because it's kind of zigzagged. Cool. All right. So remember the hierarchy, and I just kind of went over it like 4,000 times, right? Muscle have bundles called fascicles, have bundles called fibers, which have myofibrils, which have myofilaments, right? Which are those sarcomeres, which are broken up into myosin and actin. Okay. And this is what it's all about right here. And there's a little GIF here. I'll just let it play once or twice, right? So what comes next? And I didn't want to put in this video because it would just be like 45 minutes long. But it's called the sliding filament theory. And this is how muscles contract. And we can kind of see it happening right in front of us here. You have a thin and a thick filament. Well, if you remember, actin, thin, myosin, thick. You have the actin up here, the myosin down here with all these funky heads on it. How do they actually contract a muscle? Well, it's through this process called the sliding filament theory. And again, let's watch it in this rotation right here. You have these chemicals, which we'll talk about, that bind to the actin. All of a sudden, the myosin grabs it and shortens it, right? It shortens that sarcomere. It slides those filaments. And we said the sarcomere is the contractile unit. So if I shrink a sarcomere, it gets a little bit smaller. But if I do that 1,000 times along a muscle, what's going to happen? It contracts, as we see here. Okay. So that's what comes next, and be prepared for that. So, hey, make sure you go through your notes. You got everything that was missing here. Go back and get anything you did. And stay tuned because we'll see you on the next one.